Welcome to Sabby Sabs podcast. I'm your host, sabrinasalvati. My special guest today is Craig Mokhiber. He is a former UN official and an international human rights lawyer. Craig, thank you so much for joining me.
Happy to be here, Sabrina. Thank you.
So I guess first, I want to start with a little bit about your background so that people understand where you're coming from. I know I first heard about you when there was the story that you resigned from the UN. So I want to start with that. Could you explain to everyone why you decided to resign from the UN and how that relates to this conflict with Israel and Gaza?
Sure. Well, I mean, it was the situation in Palestine and Israel that sort of pushed me over the top. I was engaged in a discussion at the UN beginning early in 2023, when there were a series of atrocities by Israel being perpetrated, in fact, in the West Bank, including military assaults on villages, wholesale ethnic cleansing, settler pogroms in villages like Hawara. And as I had on human rights situations all around the world for my 32 years as a UN human rights official, I was speaking out quite publicly about those violations. And a couple of things happened at that moment. One was that I noticed that the senior UN officials, my colleagues, were not addressing these violations with the kind of seriousness with which I thought they deserved to be addressed. There was a certain trepidation about criticizing Israel for these violations out of fear, legitimate fear for one, pressure from powerful Western states like the US that don't like to see critique of Israel. Secondly, organized smear campaigns by Israel lobby groups that can be quite vicious, and in fact, that turned against me during that period in quite an organized and vicious way. And that overly trepidatious approach on the part of the UN, I thought, was compromising our responsibility under the Charter, under UN human rights instruments, to speak out for the victims, regardless of who the perpetrator was. But then the situation got worse in the early part of the year, February and March, where I was basically told to shut up. For the first time in all of my decades as a UN human rights official, I was told not to speak out, in particular on the kinds of violations that Israel was perpetrating, and to leave that to the Secretary General and other, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, other senior human rights officials. And that's the first time I had been ever asked to do that. And that was something I wasn't comfortable with. So at that time, I communicated my very deep concerns about that overly trepidatious approach, about muting ourselves out of fear for powerful Western states or Israel lobby organizations, and said that I did not want to proceed on that basis, and indicated that I would leave the organization in the coming months. Well, of course, then the situation on the ground got worse and worse and worse, leading all the way up to full-blown genocide in October. And that's when I penned that letter that ultimately went viral as my last official act at the UN, setting out where I thought we had gone wrong on Palestine, what the organization was doing wrong, how it needed to change from a human rights perspective, and setting out what I thought were some 10 steps to get the international community and the United Nations back on track, because it had been pushed off track about 30 years ago as a result of the Oslo process, when the UN and the broader international community abandoned international human rights, international law, in favor of what I've called this amorphous political project of just promising maybe sometime down the road, there'll be a two-state solution, which turned out to be an absolute smokescreen behind which we saw continued dispossession, persecution, settlement activity, the exacerbation of the human rights situation on the ground in the occupied Palestinian territories. And yet, a very fearful UN, afraid to abandon that failed paradigm, and I think needing to open up the conversation. That's what that letter was all about.
I want to talk to you a little bit about the role of the UN, because I struggle to really understand where the UN goes from making a statement. I can always count on the UN to make a statement. I understand that. But then I feel like after that statement is made, there doesn't seem to be any next step. So could you describe a little bit about the role of the UN once they actually acknowledge that there are human rights violations? What is the next step after that?
Yeah. Well, there's the UN and there's the UN. My critique of the UN has been of the senior political leadership of the UN and of some of the intergovernmental bodies. It is not a critique of those sort of frontline human rights defenders and humanitarian aid workers, and certainly not of the more than 150 UNRWA staff who have been murdered by Israel just in a matter of a few months in Gaza. But there are a number of independent human rights mechanisms within the United Nations that are very principled. They base what they do and what they say on international human rights law, international humanitarian law, international criminal law, and they are what brought me to the United Nations 32 years ago, because at the time I was a human rights activist on the outside, and I was finding in the 1980s in particular that the UN was on the same side that I was on death squads in Central America, on apartheid in South Africa, on persecution of Palestinians in the Middle East, even while powerful Western governments were always on the wrong side of those issues. And so that UN, that norm-based UN, that principled UN was what brought me to the organization. But over a period of time, what we have seen is that the political side of the House has gotten weaker and weaker and more deferential to power and less willing to speak about norms and standards, especially when it comes to Palestine and Israel. And there are parts that are, the International Court of Justice, the World Court, is a UN mechanism. It is a court, and it's finding that there is a plausible case of genocide against Israel, and its orders to Israel to cease the activities that amount to genocide is a perfect example of that. But of course, the International Court of Justice, the independent special rapporteurs, the treaty bodies, the commissions of inquiry, all of the most principled parts of the UN, separate from the political parts of the UN, they have no enforcement power. Enforcement rests first with the Security Council, which is unable or unwilling to act to protect people because of the veto. So in this case, the US has used its veto over and over and over again to protect Israel from any accountability for gross violations of human rights, humanitarian law, or even to order a ceasefire. And so the Security Council, as the main enforcement mechanism, for example, we see now that Israel is in breach of all of the orders of the World Court and is supposed to report back to the World Court within 30 days, any day now. But we already know that the orders of the court regarding large-scale killings, regarding imposing conditions of life that would bring about the destruction of the people in Gaza, impeding humanitarian aid, continuing the siege and the cutoff of water and food and fuel and electricity, and continuing its statements of incitement and genocidal intent. All of that has continued since the court's order, and the government of Israel has made very clear they have no intention of respecting what the court has done. Normally, what would happen now is it would go to the Security Council for enforcement. The Security Council can order enforcement measures. The US will almost certainly veto that effort, and it's made that very clear, at which point it goes to the General Assembly. The General Assembly is the more democratic body. It's 193 member states, one state, one vote, no vetoes. And they could take very powerful measures. They could adopt resolutions that included things like removing Israel from international organizations, calling for diplomatic and consular sanctions, calling for boycotts, divestment, calling for legal action in third-party courts to hold individual Israeli perpetrators accountable. There's a lot of really concrete stuff that they could do. They could set up a tribunal. They could set up new mechanisms like they did to oppose apartheid in South Africa in order to bring pressure to bear. But you can be absolutely certain that the US and its Western allies will be working behind the scenes to pressure individual delegations, especially smaller and poorer countries, using carrots and sticks to say, you must not support anything meaningful in that General Assembly resolution, or if you do what we say, we'll give you some aid. If you don't do what we say, we'll cut off your aid, or we'll put you on the bad list, and people knows what happens when the US puts you on the bad list. So that will certainly be happening. There nevertheless is hope that a majority of member states would be willing to stand up for something meaningful. And then thirdly, it's not just for UN mechanisms to enforce international law, particularly when you have a finding by an international human rights mechanism or by the International Court of Justice. Every state is obliged, has its own legal obligations in order to give effect to those decisions. And so individual states or small groups of states collectively could act together with the kind of principle with which South Africa has acted in bringing the case in the first place, to impose various kinds of sanctions and other measures, or to bring criminal cases against Israeli perpetrators, or, by the way, against Western actors like Americans and Brits and others who have been complicit in the genocide that has been unfolding in Palestine. So all of those are possibilities for enforcement. The individual mechanisms themselves have no enforcement power, but it has to be said, enforcement power or not, the decisions of the World Court, of the International Court of Justice, are binding. I've heard people say, well, it's not binding. They are binding decisions under international law, but it falls on the other states, and by the way, on the rest of us, to bring the pressure to bear necessary for enforcement. And that's where all of my hope is, Sabrina, is that it's that people in this country, in Europe, and around the world are standing up and taking action, sometimes at terrific personal risk, to speak out and to demand that Israel be held accountable for its crimes. And I think there's a shift taking place. And so the age of impunity has reached a peak where it can even permit genocide, and where Western states will participate in that genocide. But the age of impunity, I think, is beginning to show cracks. And I hope that the actions of all of the people, labor unions, churches, synagogues, mosques, human rights organizations, peace organizations, Jewish Voice for Peace, all of these groups will help to tear that final shreds of impunity away in this case.
Your point about the West is exactly why I was very, I guess, somewhat disappointed about the ruling from the ICJ that they didn't call for a ceasefire, just because I felt like if they would have called for a ceasefire, that would have put more pressure on the United States to also call for a ceasefire. Now, some of the cities here have called for a ceasefire in the U.S., but as a collective, not so much. I still say I'm very proud of South Africa for bringing Israel to the ICJ, because they actually showed the world who Israel is on the world stage. And I think that's incredibly important. At the same time, could you explain to people like why the ICJ not calling for a ceasefire? First of all, why you think they didn't call for a ceasefire, and why you think that may not be as important as we thought?
Well, I think that's right. I mean, first, you're right. What South Africa has done is a game changer. You know, there are only half a dozen countries since the Second World War that have been brought before international tribunals for the crime of genocide. They include Nazi Germany, they include Rwanda, they include the former Yugoslavia, they include Myanmar, and they include Israel. So Israel is now viewed globally, understood to be a perpetrator, not only of apartheid, which has been confirmed by every major international human rights organization, UN mechanisms, experts around the world, but of the crime of genocide, plausibly to be involved in perpetrating the crime of genocide. That's very important, because it breaks through the Western propaganda that has worked so hard to create this idea of Israeli exceptionalism at the expense of innocent Palestinians by their millions. The ceasefire language, of course, I also was disappointed that they didn't use the language of ceasefire that was in the South Africa petition. But I think if you look at the way that the court works as a court, it wasn't looking at an armed conflict between two states where ceasefire language makes a lot of sense. It was looking at allegations of genocide by an occupying power against a besieged people. And so the language of ceasefire there doesn't make a lot of sense. What the court ordered was an end to the genocide, the acts that could constitute genocide. And there is no way that you could implement the acts that the court has ordered, that include stopping the large-scale killing, stop imposing conditions of life that could bring about their destruction, stop hindering humanitarian aid, stop the siege. You cannot implement those measures without stopping the attacks. So it is, at least in substance, a ceasefire without using that language. And I think what the court did was they avoided having to talk about issues of self-defense and so on, because that was basically tossed out. In fact, all of the Israeli arguments were tossed aside. South Africa argued a very strong case, well documented with plenty of evidence, independent evidence. Mm-hmm. And Israel just basically said, delivered a lot of legally irrelevant testimony in defense, which the court essentially pushed aside and agreed with South Africa's case. So they didn't have to get into all of that kind of argument and deal with the fact that one of the warring parties, which is to say Hamas, wasn't in the courtroom. The court doesn't have any jurisdiction over them because they are not a state. They weren't there to defend themselves and so on. So they didn't have to deal with that. So, I mean, the language of a ceasefire to me is a footnote because in order, and I think the court will find this now at the end of the 30-day period, that in order to be compliant with what the court ordered, you have to stop the attacks, whether you call it a ceasefire or not. So I think it was a massive historic victory across the board for South Africa, for international law, which was also on trial. You know, had the political pressures or biases of the Western judges resulted in a different finding at this stage, the legitimacy, the credibility of international law and of international institutions already in tatters would have been, it seems to me, wounded beyond repair. And it was certainly a massive victory for the Palestinian people, especially those in Gaza and those under the gun in the West Bank. But as we see, and as predicted, and as Netanyahu himself said, they have shown no indication that they are going to comply with the court's orders.
That is correct. And I want to get to that point from Netanyahu here. Recently, it was announced that he would evacuate Rafah. And I was concerned about this as well in terms of what he meant by evacuation. I want to play this clip here from Sky News.
All right, let me bring you the latest news that's coming into us from the office of the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And as the US has warned Israel, staging an offensive in Rafah in the south of Gaza without planning would be a disaster. Now, Netanyahu's office has just released this, and I'll read it to you in full. It says, it's impossible to achieve the war objective of eliminating Hamas and leaving 4 Hamas battalions in Rafah. On the other hand, it is clear that a massive operation in Rafah requires the evacuation of the civilian population from the combat zones. That is why the Prime Minister directed the IDF and the defence establishment to bring to the cabinet a dual plan for both the evacuation of the population and the disbanding of the battalions. So
when it was announced that Netanyahu was going to evacuate Rafah, which is a safe zone, I immediately said he is going to go in and he's going to slaughter those people. Last night, a lot of us were watching the Super Bowl. I received a text message that said, Israel is killing kids in Rafah. And I immediately checked on, social media. I immediately checked Google. And sure enough, I saw a number of images of children that have been slaughtered, as we've seen all along, but even more extreme, it seems so last night. And I have 2 questions about this for you. Number one, do you feel that it was intentional of Netanyahu to implement this attack during the Super Bowl, a time when a lot of people, millions of people, are going to be distracted? And 2, what does this mean for the people in Rafah?
Well, I think there's no question that a part of Israel's genocidal campaign in Gaza is a propaganda campaign that they have invested a lot in since the very beginning. It has been a faltering, failing, transparently weak propaganda campaign because allegation after allegation after allegation made by the Israelis is quickly debunked as being entirely fabricated. And so that hasn't really helped them. And we've seen things like, for example, the bogus, it seems to me, attacks on UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency, the main humanitarian actor, coming hours after the International Court of Justice found that Israel was plausibly committing genocide. That timing is not a coincidence. That is a plan that they had cooked up long before that. And we also saw during the Super Bowl that Israel ran propaganda commercials in the Super Bowl. These are the most expensive commercials that anybody can run on American television. The US audience is the most important audience for their propaganda campaigns, because every bullet and bomb that is dropping on Palestinian children in Gaza is paid for by US tax dollars. They know that there is enormous pressure coming from the grassroots in the United States against US government complicity, and it is complicity, which is a crime under international law, US government complicity in the genocide that Israel is perpetrating. So I wouldn't be the least bit surprised if this timing weren't factored in here as a means to distract the initiation of what is the final phase of the genocide in Gaza, not in all of Palestine, that was unleashed last night with a tremendous fury, killing dozens of Palestinians, including children. And let's remember that the vast majority of those murdered by Israel in this campaign in Gaza have been children and women, the vast majority. And last night, obviously no different. I think there is at this moment some pressure coming from Israel's Western collaborators, the United States, the United Kingdom, some states in the European Union, who have been under tremendous pressure from all of us, from the International Court of Justice, and from others, and who recognize that what Rafah is, this southernmost town in Gaza, is the final concentration point of Palestinians, civilians, who have been displaced during this genocidal assault 6, 7, 8, 9 times. And every time they're instructed to move, it's always further south, further south. Israel's campaign has been to do an ethnic purge and a total destruction of all humanitarian infrastructure, starting at the north of Gaza and working their way down, which is why they've had these intense attacks happening in Khan Yunis in the south, and now Rafah, literally up against the fence of the Egyptian border in the south, where all of the survivors are clustered, now moving in to attack there as well, with the same purpose in Rafah that they had when they started in the north of Gaza and worked their way down, which is to kill as many as possible with the hope that the survivors will then flee southward, hopefully ultimately into the Sinai, into Egypt, from their perspective, or into the diaspora, or die in tents in the Sinai desert. That's it. And the so-called evacuation order is an ethnic cleansing order, as the previous ones have been. And we have to remember as well that they were told to move further and further south, including into Rafah, as a safe zone. And every time they've been told to move into a so-called safe zone, they've been attacked there, as they have been last night and today. So there's a sense of a pulling back slightly on the reins, although this will not get Biden and others off the hooks, because as they are exercising this mild rhetoric about respect for humanitarian law and allowing a trickle of aid trucks in that are largely meaningless, they have not cut off the weapons, the economic support, the intelligence support, the diplomatic support, the use of the veto in the Security Council. These are acts of complicity, also prohibited by the Genocide Convention. This won't get them off the hook. But I think that this genocide cabinet in Israel wants to go full speed ahead and finish the job in Gaza. I think that's what's begun, in spite of now some modest pressure being exerted by the US and other Western collaborators.
I agree. I actually spoke to a friend of mine recently that was in Egypt, and he told me that there are already refugee camps in Egypt. I didn't know that there were Syrian refugees in Egypt. He said there's Sudanese refugees there. And he said, based on what he saw, they really do not have the resources to take in like 1 million people, but also it's not their responsibility because they know exactly what Israel's trying to do. They're trying to push the Palestinian people out. And then there's also this issue with the West Bank. And I think a lot of people may not be as aware about what's going on over there too. Israel is still removing Palestinians from their homes. I know the UN declared before that those settlements are illegal, but that's another question I have. Once it's declared that something like this is illegal, what is the next step that to be done to make sure that Israel follows the law, or any country for that matter?
The problem is, and that's right, and while global attention has been focused on Gaza, what's been happening in the West Bank is, as I said before, is the wholesale ethnic cleansing of entire villages in the West Bank, full-blown settler pogroms against Palestinian civilians, military assaults, mass arrests, summary executions, dragging people away in the middle of the night, torturing them and throwing them into Israeli dungeons. You know, the genocide that we're seeing in Gaza is not contained within the borders of Gaza. It's happening in East Jerusalem, it's happening in the West Bank, and it's happening with persecution of Palestinians who live inside the Green Line inside Israel. And it even is happening with persecution and discrimination against Palestinians in the diaspora in Western countries, where the Israel lobby and Israel pressure and the allies of Israel and government are persecuting and trying to silence Palestinians and their supporters in countries like the United States simply for speaking out against the genocide, whether it's on college campuses or workplaces or in the streets. And that's how genocide works. It is targeted against the Palestinian people as a group. So in the West Bank, we've seen this massive upsurge by the same government of genocidal violence and persecution, continuation of expansion of Israeli settlements, these illegal colonies that now dominate the entire West Bank. And that is a part of the same thing. You know, in the court, South Africa raised the issue. You know, Raphael Lemkin was the original Polish-Jewish lawyer who developed the concept of genocide after what had happened to the Armenians and what had happened to European Jews in the Holocaust. And he pointed out, and genocide scholars ever since then have said that genocide is not an incident, it's not an act that occurs, it's part of a continuum. And the South Africans pointed out that this continuum started in 1947 with the murder and ethnic cleansing and genociding of Palestinians in the original Nakba, and then continued throughout the 1950s, and then in 1967 with the occupation, and then what's been happening in Jerusalem and the West Bank, previous attacks on Gaza every couple of years, that this is a part of a continuum of genocide. And that Gaza is just an expedited part of that long story of genocide against the Palestinian people. So that is continuing unchecked and unabated. And you ask, you know, so once these things have been ruled illegal, Israel's actions, the settlements, its constant expansion, persecution, all of those sorts of things, the problem is that the most powerful countries in the world, who have very compromised democratic processes, where, you know, the sort of human rights-based concerns of you and I are nothing next to the millions of dollars and points of pressure brought by AIPAC and other Israel lobby groups and weapons manufacturers and neocons and Christian fundamentalist organizations. I mean, these are what the governments are captured by and are responding to. And as long as the United States, the United Kingdom, the European Union are co-participants in these international crimes, and there's no doubt that the settlements, the persecution of Palestinians in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, inside Israel, what's happening in Gaza, there's no debate amongst international lawyers about the illegality of what Israel does. But Israel has enjoyed 75 years of impunity. And that impunity creates more violence committed by Israel because it says, who's going to stop us? We have the Americans and the Brits and the Europeans behind us. We can do whatever we want to do. That's why I think change is going to come from the ground. It's going to come from people, as it did in combating apartheid South Africa, where the United States, Western governments supported apartheid in South Africa straight through the 1980s, until people in churches and mosques and synagogues and labor unions and organizations on the ground rose up in this country and across Europe and said, no, we're not having it, and created enough pressure that the foreign policy of these powerful state actors was forced to change. And that's the task before us, I think, today.
And this is why the protests, I believe, have been incredibly important. And there have been international protests, thousands of people out in the street. There was a recent announcement from the ICJ. It says the ICJ will hold public hearings on the request for advisory opinion on the legal consequences arising from the policies and practices of Israel in occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. Now, this is supposed to happen from February 19th to February 26th. And I wanted to get your take on this. How much weight do you think that this holds here?
I mean, I think it's very important. I mean, this is the third important case This one is on the legality of the occupation itself in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, which legal scholars have long agreed the occupation itself is illegal, in addition to all of the practices that Israel is engaged with in carrying out that occupation. And so this will be, again, an important decision that will have impact on international organizations and what they can recognize and what they can do, but also on states that have to respect what the court has decided. And this comes, after the genocide case, which we've just spoken about, but also after a case in 2004 where the apartheid wall in the West Bank, built by Israel, was found to be illegal, and the court ordered that it needed to be dismantled. Of course, Israel has utterly ignored that and has been defended by the US government and others to prevent its implementation. But it is another important step in the consolidation of international legal positions, which are difficult for all states to ignore. And I think it empowers all of us as well, that these are not just editorial opinions that we are expressing. These are matters of international law binding on all countries, and our governments in the West are complicit in the violation of these international laws. So this is the next important step, a separate court case looking at the legality of the occupation and its associated actions before the World Court. Very, very important. This court that will be considering this is changing this month. So some of the judges are changing as of, I think, the 5th, so it just passed. For example, the president of the World Court was an American who had spent her entire professional career as a lawyer for the US State Department before becoming an ICJ judge. People were very worried about that. She was serving as the president of the court at a moment when it was deciding on the genocide claims, and yet she found in favor, as did most of the court, of South Africa's petition. Well, that court is now changing in large measure. There's a new American judge who will not be the president, and a number of other, I think 5 judges who have changed. We have to look to see how the composition of the court will change the decision-making in this case. But I think one very important thing that we learned in the recent case, people were very worried. They were trying to, for example, count up the nationality of the judges to see how they would vote. That did not happen. It was almost a unanimous decision. There was, obviously the Israeli ad hoc temporary judge who was there just to defend Israel for the most part, although he also voted with South Africa on two of the counts. And then, very oddly, a Ugandan judge who issued a dissenting opinion that looks like it was written in Tel Aviv, that made no legal sense whatsoever. But otherwise, every judge voted in favor of this decision, because it is not, politics have an impact on every court. There's no doubt that judges bring their politics and their biases with them into the courtroom. But this court is not just politics. They are also bound by the language of international law. They are bound by the preservation of the reputation of the court. They're bound by concern about their own reputations. I mean, I think this Ugandan judge, Sebatunde, is going to be haunted for the rest of her life and never taken seriously again for her very obvious compromising of those principles. Most judges don't want to be viewed that way, and they're also bound by the jurisprudence of the court that has ruled on these kinds of issues in the past, and by the way, also ruled on the legality of the wall, in which they looked at all sorts of issues that relate to foreign occupation, the occupation of the territories, claims of self-defense. So I am hopeful that there's a good chance we'll get another principled decision on this case, just as we have so far with the genocide case.
So what's interesting is before October 7th, most people that I spoke to had no idea what was happening to the Palestinian people. And I've talked about it before on the show 2 years ago, before this war began. And that was a realization factor for me, that a lot of Americans had no idea that there was a group of people that were actually basically imprisoned, so to speak. Like, there's this fence around them. They can't just move freely if they want to. They can't go into Israel. They have to have special permission if they have to go to a hospital in Israel. A lot of people just were not aware. You actually have been to Gaza. What could you explain to people about Gaza other than the description that we've seen on mainstream media, that it's this, it's a dense population and that they're all Hamas? What would you explain? How would you define Gaza?
Gaza has been called by some commentators an open-air prison, and by others a concentration camp, because it is a place, a narrow strip of land in the south of historic Palestine that is populated by 2.3 million civilians who originally were purged from their homes in Palestine in 1947 and 48 and forced out of their homes. And their homes were just then taken over by Israeli settlers who just changed the name on the door, changed the name of the street, changed the name of the town. Most people in the US don't realize there was no such thing as Israel in 1948. That was Palestine for hundreds, indeed thousands of years, and that the people who lived there were 95% Palestinian, that the streets and the towns and everything were Palestinian, and the farms and the shops, and that it was taken away from them by force in 1947 and 1948, which was called the original Nakba, the catastrophe, the genocide of the Palestinian people and their ethnic cleansing. And they were forced into what is now the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and then into Lebanon and into Jordan and other places when they were purged through a series of massacres at that time. So most of the people who are living in Gaza are already refugees. Most of them are children. Most of them are food insecure. Most of them are poor. And they are locked in a prison, contained all the way around, and Israel doesn't allow anyone to come or go without its rarely given permission. It controls every morsel of food, every bit of water, every bit of electricity or fuel that comes in. It controls everything that goes in, everything that goes out. It controls it controls the airspace, it controls the electromagnetic field, it controls the sea, and it surrounded the entire place with fences and walls and autonomous weapons and technologies designed to keep 2.3 million persecuted civilians locked in. And every few years, they attack them like fish in a barrel. And this is all a part of the broader genocide. And the Israelis have come up with colorful phrases to describe before October what they were doing to the Palestinians. For example, we're going to keep the Palestinians in Gaza on a diet, which means they limit the amount of calories that are allowed to enter into the West Bank, so that people wouldn't die of famine, but they wouldn't be able to have normal, healthy lives. And then periodically, the military attacks were designed in the language of the Israeli leadership to mowing the lawn, as if the Palestinian people are blades of grass who have to be beaten down from time to time. It is the most severe kind of foreign occupation. It is a siege, in fact, since 2005. I mean, they've been held there since 67, but with the siege since 2005. And then since October, that siege has been made complete. No water, food, fuel, medicines, anything allowed to go into the Gaza Strip. Remember, these are people who are already refugees, who are forced to live on humanitarian assistance from UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency that is there, because everything has been stolen from them, and they have been imprisoned and then repeatedly persecuted in hopes that they will simply die out, and that will be the end of the Palestinian people in Gaza. And since October, we've seen an expedited form of this, which we call genocide, where rather than doing this sort of gradually and under the radar for most of the world, they said, let's just get it over with, and moved in with wholesale massacres.
And to that point, this is why I've argued for quite some time that I don't think a two-state solution will work. And there have been many colleagues of mine that have pushed back on that, and they said that's the only option. I don't think that's the only option. I think a one-state would be a good solution, but there's also the issue of the settlements in the West Bank. I mean, if there's a two-state solution, what happens to all of those settlements? But I want to get your opinion about that. What do you feel is the best solution in reference to moving forward for the Palestinian people?
Well, beware of that language of the two-state solution. It has been, for the past 30 plus years, a smokescreen that has been used by politicians, international institutions, Western politicians, behind which you've seen only continued persecution, dispossession, settlement activity, and an exacerbation of the human rights situation. That's what that was all about always. There was never an intention on the part of the Israelis to have an actual two-state solution, and they're very open about this when you listen to their commentary. What some people are promising is Bantustans, right? The same offer that was made to South Africans by white minority rule. We will give you some tiny little dysfunctional patches of land in which you can pretend to have self-determination. That's what the two-state solution really means. And there are a couple of problems with that disingenuous claim now more than ever. First, there's nothing left for a viable, sustainable Palestinian state. All of the land has been massively settled by hundreds of thousands of Israeli settlers. These illegal paramilitary encampments have devoured most of what would be a Palestinian state, and neither this Israeli government nor any other Israeli government is ever going to dismantle and remove those hundreds of thousands of Israeli illegal settlers. So there's nothing left for a viable Palestinian state. There's a few patches on the West Bank and in Gaza for Bantustans, but that is not going to end the conflict, because who is going to settle for that in place of their right to self-determination, having lost the entire country of Palestine and everything that they stand for? Secondly, there is already de facto one state. So anyone who says one state is not possible is just repeating the propaganda of the State Department, the United Nations, and others. There is one legal authority, the Israeli government, that's controlling all of historic Palestine and Israel, as they say, from the river to the sea. There is one state, but it's an apartheid state. It's a state where you have an ethno-nationalist structure of governance, where rights flow from nationality, and nationality is defined as religion, right? So the challenge here is not counting up how many states should be created. It's equality. It's human rights. It's trying to come to a dispensation where you have equal rights for Christians, Muslims, Jews, and others. The same thing we demand for every other area of the world, but because of Israeli exceptionism born in Washington and Brussels, we never insist on it here. That's the only solution, ultimately. And that's a one-state solution. However you want to configure the state, it has to be one based upon human rights, based upon equality, as we insisted in South Africa, not on Bantustans, not on maintaining a state in Israel and then some other Bantustans or Palestinians, and the Israeli state still being an apartheid state where Palestinians inside Israel are second-class citizens. Those forced out don't have a right to return to their own land. That has never addressed the human rights of the Palestinian people, which is at the core of the so-called conflict. So no, a two-state solution is a lie. And even if it could be realized, it wouldn't answer the human rights challenges that are at the base of conflict in the Middle East.
Well said. Craig, have you thought about starting a Substack?
I have. I've thought about starting a Substack. My plan is to try to write, but I have been extremely busy in just trying to say yes to those who are willing to get the word out on what's happening there. So at an appropriate moment, I will settle in here at my computer and start putting things in print as opposed to the kinds of things we're doing now. But it's a good suggestion. I appreciate Substack very much. And when there's time, when I'm not flying around doing interviews 24 hours a day, I'll certainly sit down and write some more.
Awesome. Craig, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me, Sabrina.